Thank you for making time today uh, for this uh, for this report we're releasing. We're very excited to release it. We're looking at bail reform's impact on Ohioans' health, specifically in the form of two bills under consideration in the state legislature in Ohio. So first, I'd like to go over some of the call logistics. I'm going to start off talking about the report, and then Tanisha Pruitt, my fellow author, will jump in on with some of her findings. And then our next two panelists will bring in their experience into the conversation. Kareem Hinton with the Bail Project in Cleveland will talk about his work as a bail disruptor, helping get people out of jail when they've been detained pre-trial. Madeline Jones will then talk about the impact of being jailed on her and her family. And finally, Patrick Higgins, the policy counsel at the ACLU, will provide some broader context for our findings and the legislation. So we're going to ask anybody who's on the call to hold questions until the end. And you can let us know by raising your hand emoji and we'll unmute you if you have questions. But you can also feel free to put written questions in the Q&A at any time during the presentations, so we have them ready to go for the Q&A session after the panelists have spoken. So now I'm going to jump into the report findings. My name is Pete Van Leer. I'm with a senior researcher with Policy Matters Ohio. I realize I forgot to mention that. And this call is convened by Policy Matters with some of our partners. I worked with Tanisha, as I mentioned before, and one of our interns on looking at the impact of pretrial detention on the health of Ohioans. So most of the research out there on pretrial detention really focuses on economic costs and fiscal impact, with very few studies examining the jarring health effects of pretrial detention on individuals and their families in terms of really bringing all that together in one place. So a study from the ACLU released last year, for example, found that on any given day, some 12,000 or more Ohioans are incarcerated pretrial, and that it costs Ohio as much as $264 million a year. So, but what about Ohioans who are accused of crimes and jailed before they're tried? What does it mean for them in terms of their health, their well-being? How does it impact their families and their communities? That's what we sought to uncover by doing this deep review of research on the issue of pretrial incarceration. So we start with the understanding that Ohioans who are accused of crime deserve the same opportunity to be free from the bail trap before their day in court, no matter how much money they have, the color of their skin, how they move in the world, right? So, but what the ACLU report showed, along with many other studies, is that courts regularly use cash bail to hold Ohioans in jail before the trials just because they can't afford to buy their freedom, right? So other people are getting out because they can afford it, but a lot of people are stuck. They just cannot get out. So, and this furthermore, before even finding people guilty, the courts all too often unfairly target and punish Black and brown people, women in particular, and LGBTQ plus people who are already more likely struggling to make ends meet and less likely to be able to make bail. So cash bail is really, it's a financial promise. Like, you're required to pay some bail, and usually it's used so that people will show up for court dates. That's one of the main stated reasons, right? There are two pieces of bipartisan state legislation, House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182, that are being considered right now, and they would largely eliminate cash bail across the state. And our findings showed they would really help improve the health and well-being of Ohioans accused of crime. And it would help, obviously, their families, their communities more broadly. These bills, as introduced, would still allow courts to hold people who pose a specific danger, but they would require courts to put in writing their reasons for detention or other conditions for release. So this would mean that Ohioans charged with similar crimes would be treated similarly by the criminal legal system, no matter their status, no matter how much money they have, the color of skin, how they identify themselves. Our research review, again, was conducted by three people with Policy Matters: Tanisha Pruitt, who's on the call, myself, and Samuel Johnson, a summer intern who worked with us, a great guy from the University of Chicago. We looked broadly for research related to the impact of pretrial jail, and here's some of what we found at a high level. The imposition of financial conditions by courts has increased actually since 1990, even as some states and localities are reducing or eliminating the use of bail, and even as overall crime rates have fallen. Bail does little to ensure people will appeal for their court dates, right? So, and that, as I said before, is one of the main stated purposes of this practice. 95% of the people the Bail Project helps out here in Cleveland, by paying their bail, they show up for court dates even without having to pay themselves. And finally, bail contributes to mass criminalization, right? Mass incarceration. And because of that, because of those two factors, it really undermines public safety rather than improves it. So our review focused on some very specific issues, mental and physical health of people who are detained pre-trial, also some of the impact on specific populations I've mentioned, populations that are uniquely affected by pretrial incarceration, women and children, members of the LGBTQ plus community, and people who use illegal drugs. So, and again, our review really strongly suggests that the presumption for release contained in these two bills that are being considered in the Ohio House and Senate would really improve the outcomes of Ohio residents. And because they would write into state law a presumption for release, the bills would reduce the likelihood that individuals accused of crimes but not yet convicted would lose their jobs, lose their housing, lose custody of their children. The bills would also lessen the lasting effects of pretrial incarceration on the physical and mental health and safety of those who otherwise would be held while they're waiting for trial. We found that cash bail really contributes to the racial inequities of pretrial incarceration, with Blacks more likely than similarly charged whites to be detained pretrial, least likely to be released without having to pay bail, and less likely to be able to find adequate legal representation. A couple of quick issues before I pass it on to Tanisha. When it comes to mental health, pretrial incarceration actually increases, not surprisingly, increases mental stress, including from the threat of job loss, separation from family, and just the trauma of incarceration, which can really damage the mental health of individuals who are incarcerated while they are waiting to be tried. So we found that suicide is the leading cause of jail fatalities, and it occurs in jails at a much higher rate than in the general population. In fact, people jailed pretrial are 6 times more likely to commit suicide than those who are incarcerated post-conviction. So even among incarcerated populations, that pretrial population being detained in jail before you're convicted leads to higher rates of suicide. And finally, on mental health, large numbers of people held in jail need mental and physical health care, but jails typically lack the ability to provide adequate treatment, especially when it comes to mental health. On the physical health side, jails, we found that jails put people's physical health at risk too. So because the criminal legal system rapidly cycles people in and out of jails, there's little time to screen and treat them for illnesses like HIV, tuberculosis. And actually the pandemic showed us this very clearly. COVID's a prime example of how contagious disease can spread behind bars. People are really packed in and they're moving in and out. So early in the pandemic, this constant flow of people coming and going, coming in, being booked and arrested, booked and put in jail, and then being released, turned jails into incubators for the virus. And not only within the jail and among its staff, but it really fueled its spread into the general population. And finally, violence is a huge issue, right? So incarcerated men are more likely to become victims of violence perpetrated by other incarcerated men, while women are more likely to be victimized by staff. And trans people are 10 times more likely to be victims of violence than anyone else who's incarcerated pretrial. So that's my quick summary of some of the findings. I'm going to pass it on to Tanisha to talk a bit more about our findings.
Hello, my name is Tanisha Pruitt. I'm a state policy fellow with Policy Matters Ohio. And part of my portion of the report was dealing with those populations that Pete was mentioning that are affected by pretrial detention. So there are many what is referred to as hidden victims of the criminal legal system who are most affected when an individual is incarcerated or held pretrial. So children are among that group. Pretrial detention has a strong impact on children. A recent study found that about 7% of US children experience a parent encountering the criminal legal system. And among that 7%, Black children were 7.5 times more likely, and his Latinx children were 2.3 times more likely than white children to have an incarcerated parent. So children with incarcerated parents often experience high stress and anxiety, which can hinder their development and cause other mental health issues such as depression, PTSD, alcohol and substance abuse, and antisocial behavior, which can lead to negative later life outcomes, as well as future contact with the criminal legal system themselves. Other effects that they may suffer is decreased economic mobility from a parent being incarcerated. They may end up in the foster care system or homeless, and they often have low educational attainment due to disciplinary infractions such as suspensions and expulsions, as well as dropping out of school. Women are affected because they are most likely to have to take on the burdens of having an individual held pretrial. They take on a lot of the financial burdens and expenses in terms of living expenses, having to pay court and attorney fees and processing fees. But while they have to take on this greater financial burden, it affects them greater because they often make less than men, and they are often paid lower wages. They're paid lower wages and perform uncompensated work. So this often affects their ability to be able to pay the high bail and high bonds that are often associated with them being held pretrial or individuals that they may be related to held pretrial. When a mother is often detained pretrial, her children suffer because children are often removed from, the family if there's no one else that can care for them. So they're often separated. And women are also more likely to become victims of sexual violence by either other incarcerated individuals or jail staff, which causes physical and mental health issues. Another community that is affected by pretrial detention is the LGBTQ plus community. So the criminal legal system in the US and in Ohio has long disproportionately and discriminatorily impacted the LGBTQ plus community. We found that 1 in 6 transgender people have been incarcerated, with 1 in 2 of those transgender individuals being Black. So the stereotypes and inaccurate perceptions of transgender individuals or LGBTQ individuals in general creates a bias, which leads to courts imposing high bail amounts because they consider these individuals to be of a greater flight risk. So according to a Black and Pink survey, which Black and Pink is a national prison abolitionist organization which works with incarcerated individuals who identify as LGBTQ+. 74% of the respondents of their study stated that they had been held pretrial simply because they could not afford the bail that was assessed. So because they could not afford the amount that was assessed to them, they had to spend, prolonged periods of time detained pretrial in jail. And so those that are also identifying as LGBTQ plus disproportionately suffer while being held pretrial because they often experience extreme rates of abuse and sexual assault, which often leads to them experiencing PTSD, depression, substance abuse, and other mental health disorders that affect their lives. People who use drugs, they are also affected being held pretrial. Nationally, 63% of people serving sentences in jails identified as meeting the criteria for substance abuse disorder, according to the Vera Institute of Justice. So incarceration increases the risk of an overdose among those who use drugs while being detained. Research shows us that overdosing is the leading cause of death among people recently released from prison, and the third leading cause of death of people in custody in jails. A recent study by the US News and World Report found that of 2,600 counties that they surveyed, they found that on average, counties with the highest incarceration rates saw a drug mortality rate of 54% higher than the rate among those with the lowest incarceration rates. So this shows us that there is a correlation between being incarcerated and drug overdosing. So those that are held pre-trial that suffer from drug abuse, they are often more likely to be affected from being held unnecessarily long in jails and more likely to overdose. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanisha. That's great. Appreciate your work on this. I want to remind people we are Facebook live streaming and elsewhere on social media, and we're going to try to monitor questions there as well. For those of us who are with us on the Zoom, we're going to hold questions until we finish all the presentations. And but if you have a question you want to put in now in the Q&A, we'll have that for when we do the Q&A session at the end. Feel free to put them in there. Now I'd like to introduce Kareem Henton with the Bail Project in Cleveland, going to talk about his work and this report in the context of what he does.
Good morning, everyone. Kareem Henton with the Bail Project Cleveland. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about some of the facts, some of which you heard already, but particularly what I would like to deal with are the effects of this pretrial incarceration as it relates to the persons being detained, their families, their loved ones. And, I can't stress enough, I have to kind of just weigh on this a little bit, though it has been weighed on just before me, is regarding the LGBTQ community, where I personally have taken it upon myself to really pay special attention to these individuals, because these are the individuals that oftentimes, as was stated earlier, find themselves being abused, if not physically, they're at the very least being abused mentally and emotionally. And they have no real recourse to really alleviate themselves of these issues. And so therefore, they're really in their suffering. And it just leads to a bad situation for them all around, because they already in society have very little support. So it's very easy for them to lose everything. Detention centers are not, I repeat, are not a rehab center. They are not a treatment facility. And so, these people, if they are in need of any type of treatment, and oftentimes after being in there, they are in need of some type of treatment, because it does affect people very drastically and mentally and emotionally. I wanted to weigh in also on just the health impacts, because health is both physical and it is both mental as well. But the impacts when it comes to children and families, you have children who basically are suffering from worry. They are suffering, oftentimes they have to be with family members, loved ones who perhaps are ill-equipped to be able to house and care for them while their parent, while their caretaker is sitting in the jail. This affects their schooling, but this also affects them mentally and emotionally. These children have not done anything, and and their loved ones have yet to be found guilty of anything, if they are even found guilty. And so, this brings about, quite a bit of undue suffering that oftentimes is really, really hard to undo. We have, people that are lucky enough while they're incarcerated to perhaps be in treatment. Most aren't, but if they are able to get some level of treatment while they're incarcerated, what many don't understand is that while they're sitting in jail, the benefits of said treatment becomes unraveled, it becomes undone, because they go from having a session with a treatment provider back to an isolated cell, back to inhumane conditions that result in the work that's been done within that moment being undone. And so people oftentimes, when they come out of jail, at the very least mentally, they come out worse than when they went in, because of certain stresses, certain abuses, certain worries, as well as just, what it does to them, what it does to people mentally and physically being in isolation. Here in Cleveland, they refer to, when you look at, for example, some of the billboards that we're seeing regarding hiring correctional officers, we see that that's what they say, that they're hiring correctional officers. Well, this isn't a correctional facility. Many of these are are their detention facilities, and many of these facilities call their officers correctional officers. What that implies is that the people that are housed therein are in need of some type of correction, which implies guilt. And that is basically gives you some type of insight into what we're dealing with as far as the mindset of that that these people that are housed within these detention centers are deserving of some type of punishment, that it is their fault that they are in these inhumane conditions. And, lastly, and you're going to hear about this here shortly, but lastly, one of the things that I wanted to just briefly touch on is that, I've noticed, a number of people that come in that are pregnant, and these women that come in that are pregnant, in spite of the fact that they are obviously pregnant and that they require special attention. These women are put into these cells that, they're forced to sleep on a very thin mattress, on these metal frames, in these concrete rooms, or brick cinder block rooms, concrete and cinder block. And it's unhealthy. They're breathing in the air coming out of ducts, air ducts that have rodent feces in them. It's just constantly recirculated air. Those things are very unhealthy for them as well as their unborn child. They're forced to have to try to rest in these situations. We hear, or one of the things that we encountered here, or one of the examples that we encountered here was that a judge found it necessary because the client did anything wrong, but because the client, well, I shouldn't say client because she never became a client, but because this individual, not because they did anything wrong, but because they did not like their demeanor, their disposition. They felt that this person was not giving the court the highest regard that they felt. All these things were based on personal feelings, not based on anything that the client or the individual had done. And this woman, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, sat in jail for nearly a month. And when, through the efforts of people in the community applying pressure, we were able to help secure her freedom. And when she got out, within 90 minutes, she had her child. These are the things that, I hope that people think about when they talk about pretrial incarceration. We need to really consider doing something for these women who find themselves in these situations, because oftentimes they're abused before they even come to the jail. And then after they're in the jail, they're not in a good enough setting that will perhaps allow them to get help for any kind of injuries or concerns that happened as a result of their arrest, because many times, as in the case that I just mentioned, this woman was thrown on the ground and handcuffed before she was brought in. So she had obvious concerns. And I believe that if there is an issue here in Cleveland or Cuyahoga County, we have what they call a diversion center, which is afforded to people that have mental health concerns, as well as perhaps they have substance use issues. And these individuals are supposed to be afforded, in many cases, certain considerations, so that they don't come into a jail which is not a treatment facility, and these individuals are allowed to go into this diversion center. Well, I believe wholeheartedly that those same types of considerations should be given to these women that are pregnant, because of the fact that, the stresses of being held in isolation is not healthy for the child. If they're a mother of one, if they're pregnant, there's a possibility that they may have other children. So there's going to be an impact on their children that are at home. And we feel that it's just going to get, it's going to spare them suffering and possibly spare the municipalities, the cities, the counties, a whole lot of money in litigation. So, and that affects taxpayers. I'm not saying this in the interest of the cities and municipal governments, but I'm saying this also in the interest of citizens as well. This is something that we should all want. I appreciate everybody listening to me. I appreciate you inviting me over there at Policy Matters.
Thanks so much, Kareem, for letting us know what you're seeing and hearing and the work that you're doing, and very powerful, distressing story. The story about the mom who was 8 months pregnant. We now have Madeline Jones, who is here to talk a little bit about her own story of being jailed and detained pre-trial and the impact on her and her family. Madeline, thanks for making time.
Hi, I do apologize. I'm driving to work. So I'll try to tell it as best as I can. I had a charge in the Cleveland County, and I turned myself in willingly. I walked in there, turned myself in just to get everything handled. And when I did, I had a bond set, which was a $10,000 cash and surety bond. So it should have been, 10%. And when I went in, I was pregnant. I was already, bleeding when I went in, but just light. I didn't think anything of it. I knew I would just be going in and getting right out just to go handle that. I just wanted to take care of the warrant so I can have that off of my back. I have 4 children. And so when I turned myself in, I had the bond. When I go downstairs, they asked me all the medical questions. I let them know I'm pregnant and I'm bleeding a little bit. And then they want to send me to the hospital. Well, at first I didn't really want to go to the hospital because I'm like, I'm about to get out. I could just wait. But it was like their policy or whatever to take me to the hospital. But as I went to the hospital, I just refused. They looked at me and I had refused any further medical treatment because I knew that I could just go back and I should probably be bonded out by the time that I get back to the jail. I didn't want to be shackled, and I didn't want anybody to touch me. So by the time I got back to the jail, I was assuming that, my bond was paid and everything was settled. And it come to find out that somewhere along the lines in the courthouse, they messed up my paperwork. So I guess that meant I wasn't getting out. And I knew my bond was paid, but they told me that, or he told me that Kareem let me know that the paperwork had got messed up, and that there was nothing that they could do in that evening for it. He went up there, he tried, and there was nothing that they could do. So I went back there. I'm still bleeding or whatever, and I go. At this point, I'm like, I'm not getting out of jail, so I might as well go back, and I gotta make sure I check on the baby and stuff. So when I go there, I let them check me. I'm still in shackles. I'm irritated because I'm still in jail. The kids are expecting me to be home. I thought I was just an in and out situation. And so when I get to the hospital, they let me know that, the baby's not in there anymore. I had a miscarriage or whatever. My levels were still super high, but I had been bleeding miscarrying. So there's really nothing that they can do for that, so they don't keep you at the hospital. So I had to go back to the jail. So it was later that night. I spent the whole day going to the hospital and dealing with the jail. Later that night, when I got back from the hospital, long day, I'm still bleeding or whatever from the miscarriage. They have me sit downstairs in the, I don't know, wherever the holding place until they take people upstairs. And I sat down there bleeding for I would say an hour, 2 hours before somebody took me upstairs. So then I asked them can I have take a shower? It was an issue for me to take a shower. They didn't let me take a shower. I had to request for the corporal to come in so I could take a shower. And I had just went through all this horrible stuff. And so that's pretty much my experience with going there. It took me away from my kids. because of their heirs. And it was very, very stressful being in there in that situation, thinking like I could have just been even in a more comfortable situation, trying to, handle my business properly. But yeah, that's pretty much my story.
Well, thanks, Madeline. That's hard to hear that story, but it sounds like from what Kareem said, it's really not that uncommon to have women who are pregnant and, to be treated that way, to be mistreated really, and put in really not get the treatment they need and not get the to be in difficult circumstances while they're detained. So appreciate your willingness to share your story, Madeline. Yes.
I just wanted to add regarding Madeline's story. She was, of course, released the following day, and this was after going down there, waiting, pushing the issue, calling the attorneys, the public defenders that were reaching out to the personal numbers of the judge and of the bailiff, where finally the judge took care of it. And but it was by the afternoon that this actually happened, which meant that, if we didn't have the clerk who was in the clerk's office or clerk's window who was taking the payments, if they did not have the compassion to wait around a little longer, because she wouldn't have even gotten out that weekend, because they shut down at 12:30, and if you don't get them out by 12:30 on Saturday when they're in felony court, they're not coming out until Monday. And so if it wasn't for that clerk having some compassion, but it just appeared that no one had this sense of urgency, in spite of the fact that they were aware by Friday afternoon, Friday evening. And so I just kind of wanted to add that, and just to say, hey, Madeline, and I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, yes. Also, and I would also like to add, as I heard somebody mentioning in the beginning, like being incarcerated before you're found guilty or whatever, because I sat in there on a felony charge, and I turned myself in or whatever. I sat 20 days in jail for them to throw my whole case out. So I had a crazy experience, and then I also had to sit in jail for 20 days. When I went back to court, because I had a negative urine. So for that they revoked my bond. So on the revoked bond, I had to return myself back in, and I sat in there for 20 days. But at the end of it all, they threw my case out with no charges. So yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, and also just bears repeating that, you had Kareem advocating for you and really pushing to get you out. And I imagine a lot of people don't have that. Anybody
he's great.
trying to help them. So I think, yeah. All right. Well, thank you both. Next, we'll have time for more conversation after. We'd like Patrick Higgins, the policy counsel at the ACLU, to jump in and talk a little bit about the context of these bills and what it means for Ohio.
Thanks, Pete. So yeah, first things first, happy to be kind of the bookend at the tail end of this. Primarily want to commend Policy Matters Ohio, especially Tanisha, Pete, and Samuel for their work on the report, which I think I'll get to in a second, is just critically important for a number of reasons. But secondly, wanted to thank Kareem for sharing his perspective, and most of all, Madeline for sharing her story, which is, I think one of the most compelling things about this report is her story, which highlights it and shines a spotlight on it, is that, this bail legislation and the discussion we're having today has a profoundly human element and impact. As Pete mentioned at the beginning of his comments, policy folks can get into the weeds, can talk about technical things, can talk about legal things, but really important to this conversation is this really human impact of our bail system as it stands today. So, the report, which is remarkably accessible for how technical and legal this system is, is a bleak illustration of, just how dire the need is for the legislation and true bail reform. So, I'm excited because I think the changes in Senate Bill 182 and House Bill 315 reflect that. As a result, they carry with them a broad coalition of support, which I think only becomes stronger when we talk about this human impact of the bail kind of scheme. So, just as far as some kind of place setting, some of this will be a little bit redundant, but I think it's important to say is that folks who are held pre-trial, which Madeline demonstrated, Kareem talked about, Pete and Tanisha pointed out, these are legally innocent people who are being held prior to the point of being found guilty of a crime. And so when we think about this human impact, we're talking about legally innocent people. And so, I think it's easy sometimes, and I think Kareem lifted this up, is there's sometimes this stigma or feeling of deservedness when folks are incarcerated, which is a much bigger and deeper discussion that we need to have of, deservingness, but we're talking about legally innocent people. So we, also know from our research, and this is again lifted up in the report, that, cash bail is used as this proxy or kind of stand-in for a public safety argument. And really the purpose of cash bail is to require the return of someone to their hearing date. Instead, since that kind of inception, it's morphed into this space of a public safety argument, which is really devastating again to this human element of the bail scheme. So as Pete mentioned before, we know that there's over 12,000 people around the state that are detained pre-trial on any given day. These folks are an overrepresentation of Black folks and other people of color, LGBTQ plus folks, and a number of other communities that Tanisha lifted up earlier. And I think this is also important to discuss where those communities intersect. And those identities especially bear the burden of our unjust and two-tiered bail system, where the decision or determining factor in whether or not you get to go home to your family, community, workplace is the amount of dollars in your bank account and not really any other factor. So we're excited that the bail legislation addresses that specific point, creating a presumption of release, and for those concerns about public safety insofar as they exist, creates a mechanism for our communities to remain safe as well. And so, Pete did mention before, we do like to get into the weeds sometimes, just as a part of this broader coalition of, the great economic cost to our bail system. Our fiscal analysis at the ACLU found that the changes proposed in Senate Bill 182 and House Bill 315 would save the state somewhere between $199 and $264 million annually. So, can't put a price tag on this really human impact of our bail system, but we were able to quantify it, and I think it helps bolster this argument that the time is now for these changes. And so, getting back to the point of the report, I think also, important to underscore and shining a spotlight on this human impact is, not just this legal point of legally innocent people being held pre-trial, but what they lose out on and what their communities lose out on as a result, which I think is another highlight of the report. Access to critical health care, retention of employment, housing, when you lose your employment, becomes unstable, and familial relationships, custody of children, are all things that we think are hallmarks and important reasons to make sure that this legislation gets passed. And so we also had the opportunity to do some polling that I think really underscored that the time for bail reform in Ohio is right now, if not yesterday or last year or years ago. And so, we've got polling that suggests from the folks that were polled that 75% of Ohio voters believe that Ohio's criminal justice system is in need of reform. 69% believe in creating a release path for most people to go home on the same day as their arrest if they do not pose a flight risk or are not a threat to anyone else. And then, finally, 70% believe in reforming cash bail so we can ensure each and every single Ohioan is treated fairly in the criminal legal system, regardless of skin color and ability to pay. So, the appetite is out there. Speaking more generally, the coalition of folks that are supporting this legislation is broad. It is conservative groups, it's progressive groups. And again, to lift up some of the stories we heard today, directly impacted people, are the primary example of why we need this change and need it right now. And so, the legislation right now where it stands, Senate Bill 182 is in the Senate Judiciary Committee. We've had proponent testimony. And so, we're waiting in the wings for this to continue moving forward. We're gracious to the sponsors for bringing this to the legislature, both in the Senate bill and its companion bill, House Bill 315, over in the House side. The time to move this through, as I mentioned before, is right now. So we're thankful for this report and for bringing this human element to the need and to the folks that were on the call today, especially Matt, for sharing their story of why this is so critically important. So, thanks for having us on today. Happy to assist with questions as they come up.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And so now we can move into Q&A. If anybody who's participating or watching on social media on the live stream, please feel free to put in a question. We do have one question. Patrick, I'm glad you mentioned the broad bipartisan sort of across the spectrum report. It does seem like support for this kind of reform. It does seem like this is a moment that really bodes well for this kind of change. What in the bills would you say set these bills apart, the reforms that are moving right now in the Ohio legislature, from what's happening in other states, other localities? I mean, what makes it stronger? What really makes it work in your perspective?
Sure. I think the critically important thing is this presumption of release. I think when we operate from that place of these are legally innocent people, and understanding the devastating impact of even a few days in jail, that presumption of release is just critically important to making sure that we're not destabilizing families simply because they don't have the cash in their bank account for bail. Beyond that, I think we also have the benefit of we're not the first to do this. There have been a few states and other jurisdictions that have, taken strides toward cash bail reform. Those have had, I think, again, I won't venture too far into the weeds, but those have had success, and we've learned from that success. But we also, as a part of this broad coalition of support, have taken into account, a number of concerns, and the hallmark I think of that is, a lot of folks when they hear about that presumption of release say, "Oh my goodness, we're just letting everybody out of jail." Which the presumption of release implies that we want folks to go back to their communities where they can get the support they need and then return to court for their hearing date. There is a step in the legislation that allows, if a prosecutor or judge has concerns about the person's release, if it's for public safety reasons, it allows that prosecutor or judge to say, let's hold a hearing on conditions of release. If they have those concerns, they can find that least restrictive means of addressing that concern so that person still can go, hopefully home to their communities, contribute to their families, have that stability in their life without having it derailed by the amount of money in their bank account.
Great. Yeah. And thank you for pointing out, that it's not just that there are ways for people to be detained if they do present a risk. I think that's really important. Kareem, one of the stated reasons for bail's use right now is that it really is a way to get people to return for the court appearances. But at the Bail Project, you've had the experience that it really doesn't serve that purpose, that you've been able to help people, and yet they still return for the court appearances pretty like 95% of the time, right? And what do you think that's about? Like, what do you do? Like, how do you help people make sure they get back for their court appearances? What do you think really does help people? If we can eliminate bail, how do we make sure people return for their court appearances?
Well, I mean, it's two things. It's one, it's the release with support. So it's not just primarily about us getting a person out of jail and just stop there, but it's getting them out of jail and providing them the support they need. For some folks, it may be that one of the causative factors of them having a brush with the criminal justice system lies in the fact that they're homeless. If it perhaps may be that they are in need of some type of treatment regarding substance use or mental health treatment. And so by helping to address some of these issues, along with others, what we have done is just basically given them a chance, a better shot. It helps them to, it keeps their life from spiraling out of control. But that's the other thing as well. By also just getting them out, allowing them to keep their jobs, allowing them to not maybe lose their place of residence, allowing them to, and their families to not have to forsake paying a bill, getting groceries, making that car payment or that house payment. There's some control, there's, some harm reduction that's being done. And so that keeps their life from spiraling out of control, which allows them to focus on what's important, and that is that legal matter that's right there before them. So it's really about just, the support. And so these folks, and I would also add this. By the number of folks who contact me after they've gotten out, after their case is over, they show that there is this heartfelt appreciation for it. It's like, hey, you took a risk on me. I wanted to show that I was worth that risk. I appreciate you, and I'm not going to let you down. Or, hey, you see, I didn't let you down. And that's what I really, those are some of the reasons I think and feel and really know in my heart of hearts why people come back. They just need support. They just need somebody to believe in them, because understand that when they find themselves incarcerated and they know what is before them, for many people, that is perhaps their lowest point. And so when you give that helping hand at their lowest point, that's when you can have a truly, truly, impactful, impact within their life. And it just steers them, in a direction forward that is, productive and successful.
Thanks so much, Kareem, for that. We have a question from Danny Eldridge from Hannah News Service. So if Danny, I've unmuted you if you'd like to talk.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. So you mentioned House Bill 315 and Senate Bill 182. Those both have received two hearings back in June. Can you just talk about what, it seems to be bipartisan support for this. So why are these moving so slowly, and what, is the plan to kind of get these, moving over the next several months?
Patrick, do you want to take that, or I can do it?
I think the first step there, you're welcome to as well. I think, just briefly what we're seeing is legislature is awfully busy right now. Number of things that are taking priority. I'm sure we're all familiar with the, I know the sponsors are eager to keep these moving along. And so I think, we'll continue offering support. I think this report is, again, a great kind of illustration of what's at risk if this legislation doesn't continue to move forward. Pete, I'll let you add in what you had to say on that as well.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I do think, as you said, they're really busy at the legislature, but there's also, this is I think there's a lot of dialogue and like how to move this forward and really to maintain the strength of the bills, but also make sure that it really is fully supported by a lot of members of both caucuses. So I think there's just probably some conversation going on to how to move it forward. But I think, yeah, there, as you can see, there's a lot going on in the legislature that they're focused on. But we've got some time to get this through. That it's going to take some time, but it's going to. All signs are that we're going to keep this moving forward. So. We had a question specifically about the savings the ACLU found from bail reform from your report last year, and where do the savings come from? Patrick, if you could address that.
And I apologize, I don't have these numbers directly in front of me right now, but I can speak more generally that there's a huge cost to incarcerating a person, and again, underscoring the cost to that person and their family in this personal sense, but the cost merely of incarcerating someone, holding them in a jail, I hate to call this providing for them. So, feeding, housing, if we want to call it that, incarcerating, that person is drastically higher than alternative mechanisms of making sure that a person returns to court. So that's the primary cost savings. I know that report is available for folks that want to check it out on our website. And I see that Pete just dropped it in the chat as well. So I hope that folks can take a look at that. I apologize, I don't have those numbers directly in front of me right now, but do know that the huge cost of incarceration, there are much less costly alternatives to incarcerating a person. And again, just kind of uplift what Kareem said before about supporting a person when they go home. The legislation also anticipates some of that need of providing reminders or bumps to people, nudges to make sure they return to their court dates are shown to be very effective. So if that's a text message, phone call, whatever it is, getting that person back to court is significantly less costly than keeping them locked in a jail.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks, Danny, thanks, not Danny, but the other David, for your question online. One last question I think we have time for. There have been some questions around how can people get involved? What can people do? For example, in Cleveland, Kareem, how can people get involved in bail reform? And maybe then to Patrick, how else is the ACLU advocating, apart from the research and the work you're doing? So Kareem, if you could start off with how can people really get involved with this in Cleveland? You're muted, Kareem.
Sorry about that. Yeah, as I was saying, you have great organizations that are spearheading this, like the ACLU of Cleveland. Melekta Malaku, she's awesome. They have really been doing like a lot of great work. They have been the ones that have been like so very instrumental in just, I would say, delegating. And so they've really been delegating folks, having, hosting these think tanks, and just spearheading specific or particular actions. But, beyond that, I could say, reaching out to myself or the Bail Project in general, we could help to facilitate and coordinate ways in which people can support, because support, takes different forms. And so sometimes, supports, just to be quite honest, it looks like, donations, but other times its support may have to do with maybe there's a particular field in which you specialize, where you work. We have we have a partnership with students over at Cleveland State Marshall College of Law, who volunteer with us, and they help us field some candidates that show up in court. And because they're able to be in contact through the courts a lot sooner than they would come across our desk, so to speak, they're able to spare these folks like more than perhaps a day in jail, which is really great. So, I mean, it just get in contact with us and we can brainstorm how it is that you can best assist us in this work, because it takes very, very many forms.
And great, thanks, Kareem. And maybe to close us out, Patrick, can you just talk about how people can get involved with the ACLU is doing and how people can get involved in that?
Yeah, just to underscore what Kareem said, you mentioned Melekta, who's one of our organizers. It's definitely true. There are organizers with the ACLU around the state, hosting events like Kareem mentioned, the town halls, think tanks that are organizing folks, really in their communities around these issues. So I encourage you to check that out. Again, I'm sorry to keep referencing our website, but there's a list of different bail reform town halls happening around the state and on our calendar looking into next year as well. So yeah, go to those, get involved, reach out, lift up the stories of directly impacted people and make sure that, they're centered in this movement. There's also, I'm sure will be time for future legislative work, sharing stories so that, we continue to focus on, the truly human and, personal impact of this legislation. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I leave it.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick. And I want to thank everybody for attending and for watching us on the live stream. On behalf of Policy Matters, ACLU, the Bail Project, and Madeline Jones, we really appreciate your time and your interest in this. And on behalf of Policy Matters, thanks to ACLU, to Patrick, to Kareem, and Madeline for taking time today to be part of this important conversation. So going to close out. Thank you all again. We are very excited. The reports have been, our report has been released from Policy Matters about the health impact of bail reform in Ohio. It's available on our website, and we would be more than happy, to answer questions going forward. Please feel free to reach out to me at Policy Matters Ohio, and we will go from here. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, continue this work. Thank you all.